No? Okay, well, welcome everyone. So glad you're here for tonight's program. We're here. Tonight's program is presented by the Pat Conroy Literary Center in partnership with the Beaufort County Library System, and the series is called Carolina on My Mind. And it's a 5-book Let's Talk About It discussion supported by a grant from South Carolina Humanities. Each free public event features a different visiting scholar or discussion leader presenting a book representative of the South Carolina experience. Copies of all the books are on the back table. All you have to do is sign out and sign the number. Our topic today is David Robertson's 1999 biography, Denmark Vesey, the buried story of America's largest slave rebellion and the man who led it. Kirkus Review called Robertson's book a fascinating historical detective story. Robertson deftly teases out tantalizing clues without pushing his speculation too far. His thoughtful chronicle restores to the record a powerful figure whose story continues to challenge America's vision of itself as a place of equality and harmony. Publishers weekly praised Robertson's well-researched narrative and smooth style and deemed the book an intelligent analysis of, as well as a worthy tribute to his subject. We're honored to have Dr. Bernard Powers, Bernard, who earned his Ph.D. in American History at Northwestern University and is a professor of history at the College of Charleston, where he teaches courses in American, African American, and African diasporic history. His major work, Black Charlestonians, A Social History, 1822 to 1885, was selected as an outstanding academic book by Choice magazine. With Marjorie Wentworth and Herb Fraser, he is co-author of We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel. Dr. Powers has appeared in African American oriented documentary films, including most recently the PBS production, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. He has also served as a board member or consultant to private organizations and public agencies promoting historic preservation. Presently, he serves on the board of the International African American Museum, built in Charleston, and chairs its program subcommittee. Please welcome Dr. Bernard Powers.
Thank you very much. Mara and Jonathan, thank you all so much for inviting me to be here. It's my pleasure, it's my honor. Just anything connected to Pat Conroy, I want to be a part of it. So I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do in the interest of time is something a little bit less elaborate than I had planned. We ran into some traffic right on the edge of the city coming in, and then when we turned the corner, we Carteret Street and ran into some more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple or a few central ideas from each one of the chapters and just mention those and say a few words about them, and then kind of open it up for questions and comments. And I'm gonna do you all also like my students. If you don't have any questions for me, then I'm going to pose the questions. So I've tried to come fully prepared. So in the first chapter, one of the things that we learn is really about the unique situation of slavery in South Carolina. You know, and Robertson takes us back to the very beginning of the colony of Carolina. The Vesey conspiracy dates to 1822, but Robertson takes us back to the end of the 17th century. And you know, Carolina is different from all of the other 12 mainland British colonies in that this was the only one that was established with the idea of creating a system of what was called Negro slavery. Now, slavery developed in Virginia and Massachusetts and all the other colonies, but this was the only one that was founded with that as a foundational element in the planning for the economy and the society and so on and so forth. And one of the very crucial things that Robertson does in this early chapter is he really situates South Carolina in the larger Caribbean of which it was a part. And you know, he tells us something that I read about a long time ago, and saw some evidence of this too. If you look at some maps that date to the end of the 17th century, the early 18th century, maps of the Carolina land grant, or the Carolina colony, one of the things that you're apt to see is a labeling that indicates Carolina in the Caribbean. Carolina in the Caribbean, because it was so well integrated into places like Barbados, for example. And here, in this first chapter, we learn that so many of the settlers for the first half century of life here in this place actually originated on Barbados. And Barbados was a British settlement in the Caribbean that was settled in the 1620s. It becomes a major sugar-producing island, and by the time we get to 1670, when Carolina was settled, virtually all the land in Barbados was taken up, and so a significant number of those people who did not already have land in Barbados were willing to come to a new place, start life over in some cases, and when they come here, they would bring enslaved people with them. And so that's a very important connection early on between this place and the Caribbean world. In fact, Robertson tells us that there were a few direct consequences of this intimate connection to Barbados. And one of them, of course, is the institution of slavery that will develop here. But secondly, the slave code, the legal structure governing the behavior and regulation of enslaved people, was a direct import from Barbados. In other words, the initial slave code here was really a transfer, a replica of the Barbadian slave code. And the other thing that develops really as an outgrowth of this intimate relationship to slavery is by 1708, this place has a black majority, just like Barbados, and indeed most of the settlements on those Caribbean islands. This place will have a black majority by 1708, and that has everything to do with the nature of what was being produced here. Rice was being produced here, which is a very labor-intensive crop. You needed lots of workers in order to produce it effectively, commercially. So, let's see. And then we, in the second chapter, we learn some things about Denmark Vesey. We learn about his life, and it is speculated that he was either from someplace in West Africa or probably more likely the Danish West Indies. And there, in all likelihood, probably today, what we know as the island of St. Thomas. And he was, as a youngster, he was owned by this Captain Joseph Vesey, who was a merchant and traded throughout the Caribbean and traveled around. It's speculated that Captain Vesey might have at some point journeyed to West Africa in the course of his commercial activities, and we don't know that for sure. It was just a possibility. But this chapter contains some wild speculations, and one of them is about this voyage potentially to Africa. And then one of the things that you see mentioned here in connection with Denmark Vesey is Robertson tells us that Vesey believed in what Robertson calls the doctrine of negritude, the doctrine of negritude. And he's really not using negritude properly. That's a notion that really develops in the 20th century, and it has to do with the kind of common culture that people of African descent and the common art forms, particularly art forms, that have developed throughout the African world. And we don't know what Vesey thought or felt or knew about that in terms of culture and art and so on, but he may very well have believed in what I would more properly label Pan-Africanism. In other words, he may have more properly believed in this notion that all African people were somehow united. They might be united by their common oppressed condition. They might be united in other ways too. But it's not negritude. That's something. That's a very specific cultural arts kind of philosophy that's very much. It dates to the period of the 1920s, 1930s, and so on and so forth. We learned that Denmark Vesey had been sold to Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. Spent a very brief period of time there. And those of y'all who read the book know that it seems likely that Vesey was returned, that Denmark Vesey, who at this point in time was known as Telemark, was returned back to Captain Joseph Vesey because he was defective. So the story goes. It seems that he had pretended to be afflicted with these epileptic seizures. And when Captain Vesey returned to Saint-Domingue, the man who he had sold him to says, hey, you sold me defective property, you have to take him back. And Vesey's captain took him back. And Denmark, or Telemark, would remain with Joseph Vesey until, in the Caribbean, until 1783. At which time Joseph Vesey comes to Charleston, brings Denmark with him, sells his ship, and continues to engage in some commercial activities, but now from land, from the city of Charleston, and Denmark is with him. And again, some of you all know this, that in the course of living in the city, Denmark becomes literate. He'll pick up the trade of carpentry, and his fortune was quite good in 1799 because he'll buy a lottery ticket and win $1,500. And with that $1,500, his owner, Joseph Vesey, allows him to purchase his freedom. I think he sold him his freedom, I think, for $600, I think. It was either $600 or $900. It wasn't the whole $1,500 that Denmark Vesey had money left over. So what that means is, in 1800, he entered life as a new man, now as a free black in Charleston. So, now let's see. At this time, he would have been in terms of his age, he would have been in his around 30, early 30s at this time. Now, chapter 3 is about the African church, and Vesey will take membership and indeed becomes a leader in what would become known as the African Church of Charleston. This is a Methodist church. And what happened was, beginning at some point between 1815 and the end of 1817, there was a major exodus of African Americans and Africans from the White Methodist Church in Charleston. And Robertson doesn't really give us a lot of information as to why that happens, but we know that there was ongoing racial discrimination in the church, and we know that some other things had happened too to kind of clamp down on the supervision and regulation of what the black members were able to do. and limiting what they could do with the monies that they raised and all of that kind of thing. And that led to this exodus from the White Methodist Church. And what happened was, then in Charleston, these now former black members of the White Methodist Church, and there was over 4,000 of them, so this is serious. There's over 4,000 people that left. They created their own independent Methodist church. They affiliated it with the first African-American religious denomination, which is the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which grows out of Philadelphia, established in the late 1780s. And the man who founded that church was Richard Allen, who was himself a former slave, who managed to buy his freedom. But this was an astounding thing, to create this church in Charleston by the end of 1817 and 1818, because the AME Church was an anti-racist and anti-slavery church. It was an abolitionist church. And these people affiliated with that denomination created it right in downtown Charleston, right in the heart of the slaveholding South. So Denmark Vesey becomes a leader in this church, and there were other people, like a man who will become important in the story, Gullah Jack, who was an African, who was also a member of this church in Charleston. And Gullah Jack was a special person in that he was classified as what we call a conjure man. In other words, he was believed to have magical powers and ability to manipulate the supernatural and all of that. So I pulled those two things out to you because what it shows is that in this church there were people who were fully African, and then there were people like Denmark Vesey, who was probably born in the Caribbean, the Danish West Indies, and then there were also people like Morris Brown, whose name comes up. Morris Brown was the preacher for this congregation, and Morris Brown was African American, clearly born in the United States. So culturally, you had Africans, you had people from the Caribbean that ended up in Charleston, and you had people who were born in the U.S., all members of the same congregation. But think of this also, they're all part of the same community, which is quite a diversified community. Then let me just point out one other thing about this chapter, which is on the African church, because it discusses another group of people that we need to be aware of, and that is the people who were located along the Santee River, considerably north of the city, an area known as the French Santee. And these are people, I should say a number of these people, a considerable number, had gone to that area as the Haitian Revolution unfolded. And the Haitian Revolution begins in 1791 in that part of the Caribbean island known as Hispaniola. Would have been the western part. And the western part was French, and the western part was the area that experienced this massive slave upheaval beginning in 1791, and it would go on until 1804. And out of that slave insurrection, the enslaved people would free themselves. They would break their shackles, but they would also expel their French masters, and they would come to control that part of the island, which would become what we know today as Haiti. And this was the first situation, first and only situation in world history where enslaved people not only overthrew their masters, but then came to control the place where they lived as their own country. The only place in world history where this has happened. Well, in the course of that conflict, many of the whites, but also free blacks, and both of those groups owned slaves. They fled. And they came, they went to New Orleans, they went to Savannah, they came to Charleston. And some went further north up to the Santee area. And I mentioned that to you because Robertson tells us that this is going to be one of the areas where Denmark Vesey would do some recruiting. And remember what I mentioned earlier, that he has spent a little time, it may have only been a year, in Saint Domingue. He had spent a little time there in Saint Domingue. And this would have been before the insurrection and the revolution. So chapter 4 really gets into the discussion of the conspiracy, the plot. And Denmark Vesey lived in downtown Charleston. He probably rented a place there because there's no indication that he owned anything, no records that would indicate that. And he had these meetings in his home to plan the conspiracy to strike a blow at slavery in the Charleston metropolitan area. And the original date that the plot was supposed to mature, the insurrection was supposed to occur, was July the 14th, 1822. July the 14th, 1822. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention one thing to you from the previous chapter. So let me just mention that now. I mentioned the African church. It was a revolutionary act to create such a church, an abolitionist church, an anti-racist church. And so the members of the church and the leadership, they were persecuted by the city authorities. On more than one occasion, they came in and shut down the church services. Morris Brown, the minister, and others were arrested, thrown in jail. They were fined. I mean, there was consistent harassment. And so I wanted to make sure that you understood that. So the next chapter then goes on to the details of the conspiracy. And Vesey would hold these meetings in his own home. A number of the people who were involved in formulating the conspiracy were themselves members of the African church. Some of them were leaders in that church. And Robertson tells us that essentially what was going to happen was the slaves are going to rise up. And remember, Denmark Vesey is free. He is free. But overwhelmingly, the people that he's organizing were slaves. They were going to rise up. They were going to attack an arsenal, or perhaps more than one arsenal in the city of Charleston, arm themselves. They were going to call in enslaved people from the countryside to occupy the city, set fires at various places. And Robertson tells us that the instructions that Vesey gave was to kill all of the whites, and this will come up periodically, and that's something that I think is worthy of some discussion. And then the goal was for as many people as possible to make their way down to the docks and to escape on board ships. So white ship captains were not supposed to be killed because they were going to be the ones who would get them out of the harbor. And the ultimate goal and destination was to go to Haiti. Which is this tremendous symbol of African people's agency, revolution, and successful escape from slavery. And Robertson says, I mean, there are a number of things. Let me just point out that says a number of things that are rather questionable, and we can talk about some of these things. I want to just point out one of them now. He says Vesey made a good decision to wait until 1822 to organize a conspiracy. Well, I'm not sure that Vesey waited until 1822. It was just opportune for him to organize it then. But one of the things that Robertson says is that by this time, the enslaved people were forced to work harder and longer, and they were more abused than before because the sole crop that was being produced here, cotton, the prices had dropped. In other words, so he's arguing then that the slaves were more ripe for an uprising at this time than ever before, because what he says is the sole crop that was being produced here, cotton, the prices had dropped, and so for the planters to maintain their income, they'd have to drive the enslaved people even harder so that they would produce even more cotton to maintain the planters' income. Well, first of all, cotton is not the sole crop that's produced in South Carolina right now, and in 1822, it probably wasn't the most valuable crop. Rice probably was a more valuable crop than cotton. In fact, the fact of the matter is, in America at this time, the early 1820s, there's very little cotton that's even produced because we only had a cotton gin beginning in 1793. So the cotton kingdom is just really beginning, although an early form of cotton was being produced in South Carolina along the Sierras. But rice was at least as important as cotton, and certainly cotton was not the sole crop being produced here. What happens is Vesey and his compatriots put together an elaborate ideology to rationalize and to justify insurrection. They use arguments from the Bible, because they say that slavery, as it was being practiced, was against the Bible. They use the important example of Haiti, successful slave insurrection, and a situation where black people had come to control their own destiny as inspiration. And then the third thing was they used the African cultural consciousness that remained very present here as an organizing principle too, in two ways. Gullah Jack, remember, was considered to be a conjure man. And so Gullah Jack was able to convince some people that he was able to cast a spell over them, a protective spell that would prevent them from being harmed by the planters during the course of the inevitable battle. But the other thing that reveals a profound African consciousness here is that, we know that there were Mande-speaking people, there were Igbo-speaking people that were present, and Denmark Vesey selected members of those African cultural / language groups to organize these people along the ethnic and cultural lines that they could identify with. So an African cultural consciousness became a part of the organizing principle to structure the insurrection also. Finally, Denmark Vesey would make an effort to communicate with the president of Haiti to enlist the aid. Hopefully, he hoped the military aid from President Boyer of Haiti, and there was an effort to communicate with him by sending a letter with a black cook on board a ship that was supposed to be destined for Haiti. All right, I'm just going to say a few additional words, and then we'll open this up for comment and questions. Now, ultimately what happens is, and I'm going into the chapter 5 now, ultimately what happens is word of the conspiracy will leak out, and there will be arrests. But at first, even though one man, William Paul, was arrested, the authorities were skeptical of what he told them. In other words, they found it difficult to believe that these people were organizing an insurrection. It was just unbelievable. And Robertson tells us about something that he calls the Magnolia Curtain. You all may remember reading about that. And the Magnolia Curtain, he says, is the kind of environment that white Carolinians and indeed white slaveholders lived within. And it was this kind of notion that shrouded their minds and thought processes about slavery, in which they concluded they were far too loving and paternalistic as masters and mistresses for the slaves to ever want to rise up and do anything harmful to them. And he describes this as the Magnolia Curtain. And he says whites lived within that. And he says blacks, on the other hand, lived within what Robertson calls a sable curtain. And the sable curtain was this facade that enslaved people used and projected to whites. And it was kind of a childlike visage and attitude and personality, which suggested that, they did indeed love the people that owned them, and they were devoted to them with a kind of a childlike devotion and affection and so on. But that was all role playing, completely role playing. Now, eventually, though, after there was some additional probing of the slave community, there was additional evidence to emerge that indeed there was a real plot that was being formed, and then the authorities prepared to add extra authorities, policemen, watchmen on the streets, and the night that the conspiracy was supposed to unfold. And by the way, Vesey, when all of this was going on, Vesey moved up the date. Once he found out that there was an investigation occurring, he moved up the date, and the new date was going to be June 16th. And so the streets were occupied with additional policemen and watchmen and so on and so forth. But nothing happened, obviously, on that night. And 6 days later, Denmark Vesey was himself arrested. Now, the rest of the book is devoted to the trials, the details of the trials. And the thing I think to keep in mind is that there were special courts that were devised to try slaves and free blacks that were different. The procedures were different. The personnel were different. This is certainly not a jury of one's peers by any stretch of the imagination. And so there were over 70 people who were convicted of being involved in the conspiracy. 35 of them were condemned to execution. Denmark Vesey was one of those. And so one chapter is devoted to the trials. And then the rest of the book really deals with the reverberations of the trials and the kind of historical legacy of the conspiracy and the events surrounding the conspiracy, the quelling of the conspiracy, and so on and so forth. And Robertson deals with how we think about Denmark Vesey as a figure of historical memory, too. And, for example, Frederick Douglass, who you all are familiar with, when Douglass recruits black soldiers for the Massachusetts 54, he encourages them by, at one point, saying, remember Denmark Vesey. In other words, you're continuing the legacy of Denmark Vesey. And Robertson brings it all the way down practically to the present by looking at the hospital workers' strike in Charleston in 1969, and says that, look, some of the marches and the demonstrations that were not only about increased wages, but they were also about self-respect and treating workers with dignity and so on and so forth. Some of the marches that occurred during the hospital strike started at started at Emmanuel AME Church, which is the lineal descendant of the original African church, and then some of the other marches were held at Morris Brown AME Church, which is my wife and my church, and of course Morris Brown was the first pastor of the original African church. So there's another connection in the modern time to Denmark Vesey and so on and so forth. So let me end my remarks right there, and let's just talk about whatever you all want to talk about with regard to the book, anything that I've said or not said, and as I said, if y'all don't have questions, I got some questions for you. Yes. Yes, by Frederick Douglass, yes.
Was Vesey known
Yes.
outside of Carolina?
Yes. Okay, good. Yes, because, he, for example, abolitionists, and particularly black abolitionists, referred to him in speeches that they gave between 1822 and until the Civil War. So I think of a very famous one, Henry Highland Garnett, who was up in New York, himself a fugitive slave. And he gives in 1843 a very famous speech entitled Henry Highland Garnett's Address to the Slaves, in which he encourages the slaves to rise up and take their freedom. And he says, remember Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, So there are a lot of references to Vesey in speeches, newspaper articles, essays. David Walker, who writes a very famous 4-part essay in 1829, Black Abolitionists, right at the beginning of the abolitionist movement, refers to Denmark Vesey as a martyred hero in the tradition of black resistance. So there are a lot of ways in which his name is remembered and passed on, and so on and so forth. Yes, ma'am.
So I was very ignorant of the Vatican history.
Oh, okay.
But thank you so much. Now I have enough courage to actually read the book.
Oh, good. Good.
I do have a kind of a couple of questions. One, somebody told me that churches here in Newport were always featured for the context.
Well, I'm not sure about Buford for certain, but during the period of slavery, it would not have been unusual for black and white to have attended the same churches. It certainly, I'm going to draw it on them a little bit. Those of y'all who live here would be able to correct me or modify what I'm saying, but today, typically, black and white go to completely different churches. Typically, some are integrated, but very few way of comparison. But during the period of slavery, enslaved people went to church with their masters and mistresses, and in the case of free blacks, they typically would have also attended white churches. now these churches would have been racially segregated. So typically the black members of the congregation would have been relegated to the back or to balconies. Yeah. But yeah, the churches would have been biracial before the Civil War. Yes, yes. And then of course after the Civil War what happened is African Americans want to control their own religious affairs. And so they leave those biracial churches, create their own churches, and whites would have been welcome to join them, but of course they wouldn't have. But yeah, so it's after the Civil War where you begin to get the kinds of racial separation that we are familiar with on Sunday morning. Yes, yes, yes.
Does this have anything to do with racial relations?
No. It has to do with its location on the coast and the fact that foreigners, the Spanish, for example, were down in Florida, and there was this fear that Charleston could be invaded from the Atlantic, and so it was a walled city. Yeah, that's right.
So I read about Magnolia Garden.
Yeah.
There will be $3 million investment.
Yes.
What do you think? Why are they doing it?
Oh,
What is Memorial Garden Festival?
let's see, Magnolia Garden. It is, it's an old historic garden and plantation site. It's up on the Ashland River Road, Highway 61. And so, I'm sure what they're going to do is they're going to refurbish some of the buildings there.
So that they can recreate the last.
They may very well be creating some demonstration rice paddies up there, perhaps. But this would be all to attract more visitors to what is a very important historic site, and they have out there some. They have a series of cabins that were occupied by enslaved people as well as free people that lived out there, and they do African American history tours out there, just as they do on a number of plantations in that area. Let me mention two things to you. And this is the notion that all the whites were supposed to be killed. Now, I think we have to take that with a fair amount of skepticism, because remember, the book tells us we don't have any of the trial testimony from the people who were defense witnesses for Denmark David. The only testimony that we have in the trial is from the prosecution side and the statements that are made to condemn Daisy. In other words, that's how it was set up. But the other thing about that is look, this is what was going to happen, and we know this is what was going to happen. These people were going to rise up and they're going to make a bid for their freedom. There was going to be white opposition, as there always was, which means that large numbers of whites were going to be killed in the efforts of these people becoming free. So that's the context in which these statements are made. But Robertson says at one point, he says, Denmark Vesey is the antecedent to some of the 20th century practitioners of genocide. Well, that's not the same at all. But nevertheless, this is the statement that he makes. And
Robertson is?
yes, Ben Robertson.
Who is Robertson?
He's a librarian. I can't remember where.
Is he still alive?
Yeah. As far as I know. Yeah. So we've got to take some of these things with a grain of salt. We do now have, since this book came out, we do now have a monument to Denmark Vesey in Charleston, and it's up in Hampton Park. So if you're in Charleston, it would be worth a trip up there, but you'll have to get direction from someone as to how to get to it, because you can drive all around the park and you can't see it from the road. You can't see it from the road. So somebody has to tell you. But Google it and pull up the Denmark Basin Monument in Charleston, and you'll be able to get an image of it. And well, there is a house there, but we don't think the house that you see was actually his house. And some architectural historians who have studied it have concluded that that house is a little too new for the early 1840s. May date to the 1830s or 1840s. But a lot of people have thought that that's his house, but the latest work says that it's a little too young. So any other quick questions or observations? It's a book that's well worth reading, but you have to be a little careful with some of the things that the other thing that Robertson is intent on making some connection between Denmark Basin and Islam, and it's a very tortured effort to make this connection. Yes. Yes. I'd recommend Doug Edgerton's book, Egerton, Doug Edgerton, and it's called He Shall Go Out Free. He shall go out free.
And all of these men were very quickly executed to kind of
Yes.
quell any martyrdom
Yes.
happening.
Yes. That's right. At first, it seemed incredible that there was an insurrection being planned. But then once the evidence became much clearer, then the executions were very good. Yes, very well.
That's fascinating that the people who were benefiting from the system were so blind
Yes.
to the impact on the enslaved.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it plays out in many ways.
Yes.
In many
Or
societies.
oh yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about everybody's surprised about Trump.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's right. Didn't it like that? You couldn't see this coming. Yeah. Exactly. But and just as the other hand, it's the same thing during the civil rights era. 150 years later, the segregation that you say, oh well, these people are really happy and they're satisfied. It's the outside agitators. It's the communists and the NAACP coming in upsetting our Negroes.
Rationalization.
Yeah.